Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning to our friends on the West Coast. We're so happy to have you join us here today. My name is Marcy Mistret, and I'm the Director of Youth Justice at the Sentencing Project. I want to start by introducing and thanking our panelists today. They have been incredible, and I know you will learn so much from them. So my colleague, Dick Mandel, who is also the author of the report that we're speaking about today, Back to School Action Guide, Reengaging Students and Closing the School to Prison Pipeline. Rudy Banks, who's with us from the National Equity Project, and I Am We, Coaching and Mentoring. Janae Hanger from the Children's Policy and Law Initiative of Indiana, and Phyllis Jordan, who's here with Future Ed. We're coming together today to discuss an unprecedented opportunity, the biggest investment in schools that we've seen at $122 billion. I want to say that we got word today from Mr. Biden that he has issued a proclamation in support of Youth Justice Action Month, which is in October, so it kicks off tomorrow, and highlights the need for all of us collectively to wrap our arms around young people who are justice involved. But he talks importantly about his investments in education, strategies that you will hear more about from our panelists later today. He says, "We want to celebrate YJAM to give all of our young people a chance to live up to their full potential. We need to shift our approach from a default stance of incarceration to one of prevention, a strategy that recognizes that children's developmental stages and needs are starkly different from those of adults. We need to be addressing racial disparities in school discipline and support proven early intervention efforts like after-school and mentoring programs are some of the simple steps we can take to help all young people find their sense of purpose and contribute to their communities." I thought that was a great context for today's webinar. And so I'm just about to kick it off to Dick to talk about the report. And I want to make sure that I invite you to ask questions that we will make sure to respond to at the end of the panel. So Dick, go ahead.
Thanks, Marcy, and thank all of you for attending the webinar. As Marcy said, I'm the author of the Back to School report, and my job today is to summarize our main findings, also to fill you in on some follow-up research we've been doing since the report was released. Can you move to the next slide? In my talk today, I'll explain why 2021 represents a pivotal moment for our nation's education system. Specifically, I'll describe the critical challenges facing US students, and particularly adolescent students during COVID. I'll explain how those challenges are being felt worst of all by those who have suffered most during the pandemic, and why those challenges will likely be exacerbated by problematic practices that have long plagued our nation's schools. But then I'll explain why, as difficult as these challenges are, schools and communities have an even bigger opportunity to pursue promising reforms, thanks to that massive infusion of flexible federal funding that Marcy mentioned, that schools can use over the next few years to close longstanding opportunity gaps, to keep children in school, and to help them progress along the path to educational success. I'll identify some of the many strategies we have at our disposal to help realize these opportunities. And finally, I'll summarize the recommendations of our report, a two-part action plan, and I'll close by describing the initial findings of a review we're conducting to see what states are included in their plans for use of these federal dollars. Next slide, please. I won't take a lot of your time describing the data, but suffice to say that our children's progress really has suffered during the pandemic. Academic achievement has fallen significantly. Millions of students became disconnected from school, not participating or not completing remote assignments. Children's and adolescents' mental health has suffered. For older students, the pandemic has interrupted many rites of passage for healthy adolescent development. And many youth suffer trauma due to the loss of a loved one or severe disruption to their family. To me, the most troubling finding is that all of these harms have disproportionately impacted the very children who've been poorly served by our schools historically: kids of color, kids in poverty, kids with disabilities. Many experts predict that behavioral problems this year will be far more prevalent than normal, and attendance problems too. The National Association of School Psychologists has predicted that the share of students suffering emotional and behavioral problems will double this year or even triple. How the schools respond to these students is a crucial question, because schools nationwide have become far too reliant on school resource officers, SROs, rather than counselors to enforce school discipline, and far too inclined to suspend children with behavioral issues rather than to counsel them and to support them. Next slide, please. So it's clear that schools are facing a lot of challenges, but as we emphasize in the report, they have even bigger opportunities. As I mentioned and Marcy mentioned, they have these opportunities thanks to that enormous windfall of federal money, $122 billion, that was included in the March 2021 COVID relief law, the American Rescue Plan. And these funds come on top of $68 billion for public schools that were included in the 2 COVID relief bills that were enacted last year. They represent the largest infusion of federal funding for public school education in US history. Phyllis will tell you more about this funding stream, so I won't spend a lot of time, but I will tell you that the funds can be used for 3 broad purposes: to promote COVID safety in the schools, to support efforts this year to help students re-engage in school and catch up on their learning, and to begin investing in lasting strategies to promote equity in the schools, improve school climate, and close opportunity gaps. Critical from our perspective is that there's no reason why these funds cannot be used, and every reason why they should be used, to reform discipline strategies and reduce over-reliance on police. These opportunities, all of them, will be enhanced by the growing momentum, which began even before the killing of George Floyd, to remove SROs from the schools, to limit arrests and court referrals for misbehavior at school, and to revamp school discipline codes away from zero tolerance. The opportunities can also build on the increasingly strong partnerships that have emerged during the pandemic between schools and community organizations, who have the tools often and the skills that schools don't to engage and assist students and their families. Next slide, please. The final reason why the opportunity for progress is so great right now is the abundance of promising and proven strategies we have available to us to minimize arrests, to reduce the number of suspensions and expulsions, and to identify students at risk for failure and help them stay in school and on track for success. I don't have a lot of time or enough time to describe all these approaches, but I can tell you about a few. Intensive tutoring can dramatically improve academic success, studies show. Several strategies to boost attendance using text messages, for instance, or community volunteers serving as success mentors show significant benefits. Programs that teach social and emotional learning skills have shown powerful impacts. Some of the most promising interventions involve school-wide efforts to improve school climate, such as adopting restorative justice as a school-wide strategy, or the Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports Model, PBIS, which is already operating in thousands of schools nationwide. Expanding therapeutic interventions used as alternatives to suspension, creating emergency mental health response teams rather than police to respond to student behavioral incidents, and hiring more counselors. The research also shows that partnerships with community, what's called the community schools model, where schools partner with community organizations and become a hub for a wide array of services and enrichment activities, has great potential to boost academic achievement and the well-being of students and their families. Next slide, please. The report offers a 2-pronged action plan for optimizing the use of these funds and making the most of the current opportunity. First, schools must partner with their communities for an all-hands-on-deck effort during the current school year to re-engage children and to support their success using some of the strategies I described. These include strategies to promote attendance, help kids catch up academically, provide counseling, and offer social and emotional learning opportunities, and strategies to replace overly punitive responses to misbehavior with more therapeutic alternatives. Our children missed enough school over the pandemic's first 18 months. Schools should be doing everything they can to keep students in school this year by prohibiting arrests and suspensions, except in the gravest situations. We also stress the importance of analyzing data to determine how youth of color, those from low-income communities and those with disabilities, have suffered during the pandemic, and how current school practices may be exacerbating long-standing opportunity gaps. I should also say that we need to be looking at how children involved in the juvenile justice system are being served educationally. What's going on with our incarcerated kids and those returning to school after an out-of-home placement? The second prong in our action plan calls on schools and their community partners to take big steps to permanently close the school-to-prison pipeline and to institutionalize effective alternative strategies that foster student success, promote positive behavior, and address problem behaviors constructively when they occur. Things like removing SROs and minimizing arrests, revamping discipline codes and reducing suspensions, adopting a restorative justice framework and improving school climate, embracing the community school model, and providing strategic help to students who are chronically absent, behind academically, or exhibiting problem behavior so they don't get pushed out of school and perhaps into the justice system. Next slide. I want to finish by telling you about some work we've been doing since releasing the report to analyze what states included in their plans for use of the federal COVID relief funds. We aren't done with the analysis yet, about halfway through, but the early evidence isn't encouraging. While states do seem to be targeting their efforts to student populations who have been most affected by the pandemic and at greatest risk for school failure, few states so far focus on reversing counterproductive practices that fuel the school-to-prison pipeline. Most of the plans we've analyzed so far never mention arrests. They never mention SROs or juvenile court or juvenile probation or referrals to law enforcement, not even once. Some states barely mention suspensions or exclusionary discipline. Only a handful of states highlight restorative justice. Even fewer discuss the educational needs of justice-involved youth. The good news is that it's not too late. These funds can be spent over 3 years and plans can be amended and updated. So there's still plenty of time for you to make your voices heard and to help your states and your local school districts understand the urgent need to take advantage of the funding and to tackle these issues. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Marcy. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Dick. That was great. That was a great grounding in the key findings of the report, and hopefully catches everyone up for our future discussion. Phyllis, Dick mentioned that you could give us a broader context on these federal dollars. We know that Future Ed has been deeply involved in advancing equity and excellence in education. Can you share a little bit about what this federal dollars look like?
Sure. I think the slides just went away, but I know it all by heart. So, I'm associate director at Future Ed, which is a think tank at Georgetown University, and we focus on the future of education, as you might suspect. And as such, we've been paying a lot of attention to this COVID relief dollars because, as Marcy and Dick said, it's a huge amount of money. It dwarfs what schools typically receive from the federal government, and it's very flexible. This shows all the money for education, but if you look at the K-2 line, you see it gets increasingly bigger over each of the 3 COVID packages that were signed, and it adds up to about $190 billion. A typical year, I think 2019-20, the federal government put $16 billion into the Title I budget. So this is a huge increase, and it can be spent over a 3-year period. Next slide. So the biggest piece of it is the American Rescue Plan, which was approved in March, and 2/3 of the money has gone out to states. The Education Department held back 1/3 and asked states to send them plans on how they're going to spend the money. 50 states have submitted, that's DC, and 49 states, we're still waiting on Florida, and 37 have been approved. The states can hold on to 10% of the money. The bulk of the money goes to school districts, and it flows through the Title I formula, which, as you know, supports schools with concentrated poverty. So the schools with the highest needs are going to get the most money in this windfall. Next slide. So we did the same thing Dick did. We took a look at all the state plans that have been submitted. There are, of course, a lot of spending at the local level, but the state gives us a sense of where money is going. And as Dick said, there's not a lot of talk about justice-involved youth. But if you look at the priorities, you can see ways that the spending can be used to support the priorities. 39 of the states we looked at are putting money towards social emotional learning and mental health. A lot of people Nevada's hiring 100 mental health professionals. That's the state. And then local governments are doing more. Oklahoma's hiring 300 school counselors. We've always said that we need more school counselors, that school counselors are going to be better than SROs, that it's going to make a difference. And often there isn't the money for it. Now, suddenly there is the money for it. And educators and administrators understand why it's important. A lot of kids are coming back to school after the pandemic, having suffered a lot of trauma. They've lived through loss of family members, hunger, isolation. We're already hearing about a lot of behavioral outbursts and issues like that. There is a big emphasis. Schools want to calm things down. They don't want to send kids home. They don't want to suspend kids. So we have an environment where people are open to things like restorative practices, to trauma-informed discipline, and to looking at a student's mental health. So this could be a real opportunity to use those resources and get them into the schools. Now, as I said, the money runs out in 3 years, but if in 3 years a school's going to have to make a decision between a mental health counselor and an SRO, this gives us 3 years to show how valuable those those counselors can be. And if not SROs. As Dick mentioned, tutoring, it comes up in 35 states. And of course, districts are going to do some of that work too. But tutoring not only helps kids catch up academically, it creates tutoring and mentoring programs, create a real connection for kids at school. When kids feel like there's a caring adult for them at school, they're more likely to show up, they're more likely to succeed. So this can be, and for a kid returning from juvenile detention or who's in trouble, this could be a good way to get them to show up and re-engage. And along those lines, there's 26 states who are putting money into addressing absenteeism. And a lot of that is about re-engaging populations. As you've probably read, there's something like 1.5 million kids who just fell off the enrollment rolls last year. And schools are reaching out to try to find them. They don't know if they moved. They don't know if they're just not connected to school anymore. So, and they're doing things like home visits and text messaging and things like that. But, when kids come out of juvenile hall, something like 2/3 of them never reconnect with school. So this could be an opportunity to use this apparatus they have to re-engage students, to re-engage some of those kids coming out of juvenile detention and get them back into school and back on track. And Dick also mentioned data is really important. And we found 26 states are using some of their COVID relief money to upgrade their data systems. And this is really important because it's going to show where the disparities are in discipline. It's going to show, what's happening with absenteeism and truancy. There's often disparities in that as well. So in all these ways that states are spending money, they're not saying we're spending these for juvenile involved students, but smart activists and advocates can use these tools to try to support students. And I have one more slide. And that's looking at who's making these decisions. As I said, 90% of the money is flowing to the local school districts. They're developing plans now, but they have 3 years to spend this money. So figure out what your local school board is doing. Talk to people on the board, go to hearings, talk about the need, these priorities, tutoring and absenteeism and mental health, restorative practices. Go and talk to those folks about it. And as I said, the state boards of education have 10% of the money to spend. In some cases, they're just giving it to the districts, but often they're doing statewide projects. Some are sponsoring teacher training in restorative practices. So find out what your state is doing. We have on our website a spreadsheet of where we analyze the state plans, and you can look and see what is your state doing in different issues. In some states, the state legislature is making the decision, and then the governors have some money to spend. The first 2 rounds of spending, it was discretionary dollars for K-12 and higher ed. The final round is just for private schools, so that's not as relevant here. But these are all the pressure points of who's going to be spending the money and how they're going to spend it. And as an advocate or an official, this is where you're going to make the most difference. So that's it for me. But if you have other questions or issues I didn't touch on, I'm happy to expound upon them.
Phyllis, thank you so much. That was a really helpful context setting, and I appreciate you giving examples from the states and how youth justice advocates and school and people in schools can work together to push for some of these pieces. Before I turn it over to you, Janae, because I think that Phyllis set it up really nicely for the work you're doing in terms of teacher training. But I do want to mention, Phyllis did talk about this going through Title I, and I want to say in Department of Education, they do highlight obviously the Title I students, and you're talking about students who live in low-income areas, children who are African-American, Latino, tribal youth, children with disabilities, homeless children, foster children, and they do in the guidance from Department of Education explicitly mention incarcerated children. So I just want to pick that up because it is explicitly mentioned in one of those areas. So Janae, can you tell us a little bit about what you guys are doing through your PDSI Institute, and how that might connect to some of these ideas that have been outlined?
Well, I think it connects an awful lot. Thanks for having me on this panel today. I really appreciate it. And Dick, your report is just a wealth of information. It's going to be helpful to us in the state of Indiana. We're going to continue to peruse all your footnotes as well. There are a lot of really good best practices. We've been around about 10 years. We're a member of the National Juvenile Justice Network. Our work is grounded in juvenile justice. We've actually formed a coalition on youth justice in the state of Indiana. And it was because of our work in the juvenile justice sector or space that we realized that a lot of children are coming in because of what's happening in our community, and particularly with school discipline. And so about 4 or 5 years ago, we started looking really closely at school discipline suspensions, and particularly in one county, which is our most populated county, which is Indianapolis. And we saw that about 30% of the students were in schools in this particular county were being suspended. More than 10% or more of the student enrollment was being suspended in a given year. And this ranged all the way up to 90%, which was really quite a shocking statistic if you want to think about it. We're not talking about the number of days or the number of incidences. We're talking about the number of children in one given year who face suspension. And not surprisingly, many of these schools also were heavily policed as well. And we knew that there was a large percentage of kids coming into our juvenile justice system from school-based referrals and arrests. And so we really felt part of our work over the last 10 years has been in the state legislature changing laws that criminalize kids. But we knew if we didn't back this up and really start to affect these practices, that all of the gains that we're having would be short. And so we we actually engaged a national trainer on trauma. I don't know if people are familiar with the Paper Tigers documentary. If you haven't seen it, you really should. But we engaged the principal who basically in Walla Walla, Washington, in an alternative education high school, he implemented trauma-informed practices in 2013-14, and he was able to reduce his suspension rates by 90%. His academics went up across the board. His graduation rate was higher than the state average, and he would ultimately, kids that were not coming to school were going on to college. And so he has been training all across the country, and he has a book called The Trauma-Informed School. So we engaged that particular trainer, but we also developed resources around culturally responsive practices and applying a racial lens. And we engaged local resources across our state in that training. We have currently trained 3 cohorts of schools, 54 school teams so far. They're all over the state. I'd say about half are located in Marion County and the other half are around the state. We're getting ready for a fourth cohort. We've had a lot of grant support for this. We actually were able to develop a train the trainer program that has an online curriculum, and it's very unique. We worked with our national trainers and a national service education provider to come up with this curriculum, and they will admit that the equity lens is really quite unique and hard to come by. Because we developed it at the state level, it is very sensitive to the issues that we're encountering in our state. So that is one of the things that we do. At the same time, we're very focused on public policy issues. We realize that we've got to increase the supports in schools. Over the last few years, we've been engaging youth voice pretty much systemically in our events when we have them. And we continually hear they don't have enough supports in schools. They need people who can help actually prevent instead of react to incidences and situations. And so we have formed a coalition among all our professional associations, school counselors, school nurses are a part of it, teachers unions, school psychologists, school social workers. The deficits in Indiana are just like what you see in this report, only worse. I was just looking at our deficits for school social workers. The recommendation is 250 to 1. It actually is 4,639 to 1. So, it's quite a deficit. And that same high disparity with school of psychologists as well. Most of our districts have no social emotional learning staff. So let's not forget our corporations and districts too need these resources. So while we're working at the local level through practices, reforming practices, and providing information on, strategies that work, we also are working in our legislature to make sure we have the resources to get this done over the long haul.
Thanks so much.
And I want to point out one thing too, if I could just say one more thing about this training. We train teams, and it's a multidisciplinary team. It includes the principal, teachers, social emotional support staff, and law enforcement. If there's law enforcement in the school, they have to be a part of that team that you're training.
Thank you so much. I appreciate all of that, and we'll get you some questions. There's some good questions coming in, so we'll get that for you next. But I did want to ask you one other piece of this. With the width of this work, have you seen overall some myths, or were there some myths or assumptions that people in schools had? Because I think one of the unique things is you actually do bring school-based people and people that work in the youth justice system together. Were there some myths that you had to attend to?
Absolutely. We cross-train on the juvenile justice system and basically bring in the juvenile court and the judge and the prosecutors and the public defenders to say, what children are we seeing in our courts, and should they really be here? And the answer is quite a few should not. Again, what we heard from educators early on was that they were trying to get services for children. But what we know is that because we've hired so many inappropriately trained staff like SROs in our schools, they're not equipped to respond other than by arrest. And without these other supports in the schools, we're going to continue to have these practices. And so at least in Marion County, it is a JDI site, has been for quite a while. The juvenile court judge finally put their foot, she put her foot down, because it was a she back then. And she said, look, if it doesn't amount to these kinds of offenses, then don't bring these children to me, because they don't belong here. And I think at the end of the day, we got to work on both ends if we're going to stop this.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. So Rudy, you work at both at the National Equity Project, training school administrators and staff on advancing equity in education, but you also work in communities and detention facilities directly with young people through your IMWE coaching and mentoring. This is a really unique position. We don't see a lot of people that do both. Can you share what brought you to working in both of these spaces?
So I'm a survivor of the school to prison pipeline. I was arrested at maybe 13 years old for having a fake gun down the street from my school in this wooded area. It's a group of us. And when they came to arrest me, they ended up finding, I told them where the fake gun was at. It was at my house, and they got it, but I was still expelled from school and placed in an alternative program. And we're talking about Milwaukee in the 90s, where alternative schools were basically holding factories. And that later, traditional school ended for me from there. And I would later end up being sentenced to life in prison. And it was I was not guilty for what I went to prison for. And I would later get back in court and get my case basically overturned, sort of. They hurry up and came with a deal before needing to deal with holding someone in prison for 20 years for something I did not do. So when I came, and during my incarceration for 2 decades, I began to do a lot of identity work within myself, because here I was at 18, 19 years old, sitting with the possibility of never coming home again. And when I was in those circumstances, so many of my peers were in those circumstances with me who I grew up with. And our story started to sound the same, but the issue was when you're going through those things, you don't have the language, you don't have the analysis or the ability really to advocate for what you're feeling and what you're dealing with, particularly when it comes to school, because school was this place where was supposed to be this place to build us up and to hold us. But for me, going to predominantly white schools, it became another place where I did not really feel that sense of belonging. And eventually it came to that point once I was expelled at such a young age, which changed the trajectory of my life. So later in prison, hearing these same, similar stories. And one of the main jobs I would take in prison was that of a tutor. And while being a tutor, part of my job was I had to convince men who were doing sentences similar to mine, life sentence, 100 years and whatnot, that education was still important. And I understood that I could not go with the traditional approach of, hey, education is the future, when you don't see much of a future. So what began to happen was this natural, what basically is called restorative justice. I had to build relationships with these men and really hear their story, hold space for them, social emotional needs within this system and or what they needed in terms of social emotional needs and connection. And then it was this natural flow of falling in love with education. And that's me paying it forward, because I met someone when I was still in the county jail dealing with the case, who introduced me to start to understand things like racism and how it impacts me psychologically, and how I internalized a lot of characteristics of white supremacy culture, in part because those were things that were not centered. So when I hear restorative justice, and not the restorative justice where you're responding to something, reacting, or what we call in restorative justice, repairing harm and transforming conflict, but restorative justice in education is also about building trusting relationships, creating just and equitable work and learning environments. And at the core, those core beliefs are all people are worthy and relational, that, in society in general. So leaving prison, and then I got, like I said, I got my case overturned, and it was that I came home in 2015. By 2016, I ended up getting a job in the school in the Madison School District. And during that job, I started getting back into restorative justice. And it sort of crept in. I'm like, wait a minute, this is familiar. It sort of crept in, but the approach that I do, my colleagues do, and even the work that I do as a consultant for the National Equity Project and through my own LLC is we're taking an unapologetic social justice, anti-oppression approach to it, because we can throw all the funding at whatever, but if we're not positioning educators to do their own internal work, if we're just throwing money to fix kids, that's just a failed approach. But if we're really doing some soul searching as adults, and how the schools have always been a place that underserved youth of color, always been a place that center whiteness and marginalized everything else, then those dollars will fall into the hands of folks who will use things that's supposed to be set up to support, but it will end up being weaponized against the same young people who that funding and those resources were set up to support. But the support, again, has to be with the adults too, because oftentimes we go in and say, let's do restorative justice with young people, and young people will learn about this cultural shift because it's countercultural, and then they will build hope in it. And then the adults have not done the paradigm shift in the building. It would create contradiction with the young people, and it will fail. So I think as we have these discussions, it's important to center how race shows up. And Maisha Wynn has what she calls the 5 pedagogical stances. And she says race matters, language matters, history matters, justice matters, and future matters. And I think those stances will be extremely important as we approach the resources that could be built from this funding from the government.
Rudy, thank you so much, both for sharing how you got into this work, but for taking it farther than that and talking about the importance of mindset, and that this isn't just practice, it's actually a different way of thinking. I'm sorry, I'm getting distracted with the questions here. Can I ask you, Phyllis, people wanted to know a little bit about whether there is accountability measures with these dollars. Is anyone reviewing how they're being spent? Is there anything feedback loop to the federal government?
There is, and it's not clear how strong it's going to work. The federal government is reviewing the state plans that the states have sent. So far, they've approved 37 of them, but they've had issues with some others. Florida, which actually hasn't submitted a plan, but they have already said they're going to spend some of the money to give bonuses to every teacher. And the education department's like, that's not what we mean. You can use it strategically to work on your teacher shortages, but not just every teacher. Michigan has decided to send all of its state money to its wealthiest districts because they're not getting as much money through the Title I process, but that's not really what they're supposed to do. So they're going back and forth with the federal government. I don't know how that's going to end up. So yes, there's that level of accountability. Then the federal government has asked states to get plans from and review plans from each of their districts, which is a process that's going on right now. How much oversight there will be, it just remains to be seen. It may depend on the state. The education department is asking, they get data every year from financial data from both state and district sources. So they have changed, they're releasing data next week that shows for the CARES Act, which was that first COVID relief package, shows how states and districts have spent the money in 8 different categories, which include academic support, instructional, student support, technology, that sort of thing. They're very big buckets, but there is believed to be some sort of accountability there. They're going to, in the next round, ask for how they're spending the next year's worth of funding. Will show how they're spending money from the other 2 rounds of COVID relief spending. So that's some level of accountability, but there's still a lot of room for mischief or misuse.
Yes, which gives us plenty of opportunity as advocates to weigh in and make sure that people know that we are watching, right? Rudy, I have a question for you in terms of what are some of the things that you do to help this transformative shift in schools? If you can talk about some of the work that you're doing, what are some of the things that can help to transform mindsets, particularly in the time right now where we're hearing a lot of pushback. People are confusing a very small legal construct for anything that talks about race in schools. I'm just wondering if you have some tools for us.
Yeah, and that CRT thing was very intentional and predicted and things like that, but that's not the question, so I'll leave it alone. But in terms of the work, a lot of the work that I do, so I mainly work with adults, predominantly white adults who really, the goal is really to take the restorative justice piece, and again, that is equity, that is mindset work, and to really interrogate everything in education for harm. And it's 2 approaches, and this comes from the National Equity Project in terms of, on the one end, you need to look in the window piece, and the window piece is looking in the system and see how the system may be causing harm. And if we're interrogating, whether it's curriculum, whether it's policy, whatever it is, but really interrogating it. And a part of that interrogation has to be built on an awareness of history, an awareness of how history is showing up today within the system, within ourselves, which the mirror work comes into place. Now building self-awareness, like, and it's not a matter of things like any type of bias that may come up, whether it's right or wrong, because we try to pull it out the good bad binary and say it is in our blood and bone. As a man, I have patriarchy in my blood and bone. So it's not a matter of if I do, but it's there. And it's important for me to really begin to open up and have conversations with those who are impacted by my patriarchy. And it's the same thing with racism and sexism and homophobia or any other number of things. So we really take a hard look and go deep, but it's always simultaneously the mirror in the window, where while we're looking at the system, we're also looking in that mirror. And I very intentionally said we, because collectively, this is a co-journey piece. There are no experts in this type of work, I believe. So that's the adult piece. And with the young folks, it's really centering youth voice and disrupting adultism and getting in spaces and recognizing that young people have always led movements. When we think about Fred Hampton, Huey Newton, and those folks, those were very young. They were very young, 19, 20, 21 years old. But adultism gets in the way of young people who are being impacted within education for them to take a leadership role and really be invited to the table to have a voice, not just sit to be present for window dressing. So really supporting. And again, I just show up as a facilitator of these things because the wisdom is always in the room. And once relationships are built, that wisdom surfaces. And I would also add, restorative justice is not a cookie cutter thing. It's core beliefs, but it should look different in each institution, building community according to the needs of those in that community. So at the core, everyone is worthy and connected, but more broadly speaking, what we call primary justice in art, restorative justice and education is making sure everyone gets what they need. And that will be determined by the individuals who are in those communities or in those environments.
Thank you so much, Rudy.
Yeah.
Janae, I know you've talked about this before, but I'm wondering, are you struggling with any shortage in terms of identifying school counselors and other staff that can be more transformative and healing in their practice in schools?
That's a real interesting question. You know, I think the answer is not only the funding, it's also the barriers that exist in the workforce. And what we're finding is that there's certain issues that have created shortages. And for an example, I'll just give you one example. I just mentioned the deficits of school social workers is pretty extreme. Yet when you talk to the School Social Work Association, you find out that many of them are not being treated as professionals as far as salary is concerned. And because of that, there's an exit out. There's a preference to be employed where your master's degree is actually recognized, right? Because your income level is not high enough to sustain you for the degrees and the investment you made. So there's some real issues in our state, and this coalition that we formed are helping us identify what those issues are, so that we can start to work in the state legislature to see if we can, make some advances in that area as well. It's a pretty broad partnership. You really have to engage your universities. A really good allies, your pediatric physicians. They know you need these supports in schools, and they can be a very strong advocate down at the State House to start address these issues.
Can I add something, Marcy?
Yes, please do.
Building on what Dick said about community schools and community collaborations, there's often, if you can partner in ways with community organizations and bring folks in to the schools, especially right now where there seems to be an urgent need, that may be a source. And not necessarily for counselors, but for support. AmeriCorps got their budget tripled in the American Rescue Plan. So they have a lot more money for these young workers who can come to schools. They're not necessarily going to be counselors, but they could be mentors to students. They could do some of the paperwork and take the hard stuff away from the counselors and the nurses and let them spend more time with students. So those are ways that schools can, either through community partnerships or AmeriCorps, sort of beef up their staff and get some extra hands on deck.
That's great. And Dick, did you have anything to add from your report? I know Phil has covered a lot of it, but I didn't know if you had more to add because I know you covered that extensively.
Too much into nothing. I thought that was great. Thanks.
Yep. Anyone can answer this question. Has there been any pushback from parents when talking about transformative work or restorative justice? And how have you been effective at getting buy-in from parents? Or has that not been an issue?
Very big issue. I was just typing a response. I don't even know what's going on in terms of, should I be responding in question and answer? But I think one of the important keys is just involving the parents, breaking down the silos between education. Parents are our partners, and that we have to really embrace that notion. Like, parents are our partners, regardless of how they show up in these spaces. And one of the things that we done that had a really strong impact was we had a restorative process with the schools, some school staff, some board members, and community members, which were also parents. And a lot of unlearning was done during that time, because parents often hear there are no consequences with RJ, which is just absolutely wrong. But once parents come in and experience that process, I've witnessed shifts.
I would say, as far as our approach is very much to involve parents as partners. And matter of fact, I mentioned we have the Train the Trainer program. And one of the modules actually focuses, its title is Parents as Partners in School. And, so that is part of our training. That's a group that we have to engage the family as well as the student. So this module itself is training on trauma so that they understand the impacts of trauma as well, because a lot of parents don't. But it also is that the messages to the schools, they need to re-examine and engage the parents and bring them into the school community and make sure they're welcome and that they're viewed as partners in any operation of the school, and particularly school discipline.
Thank you, guys. The other question in here, Phyllis, the question is whether there is standard RFPs or if they are varied state by state.
Well, I think and I don't know that much about RFPs, but my understanding is that the decision-making is happening at the local school board and the state board of education, and sometimes the state legislature, governor's office. And I think the approach to them is not necessarily, they may put out an RFP and say, we want mental health counseling, and that you would respond to that. But if you are someone who deals with the school, if you're in the school district, I think you should go to your, administrators. If you're someone who regularly deals with the school district, I mean, the business officers in a school district are often the point for this. The school board, depending how open-minded your school board is a place to, go. And they may be there. One of the things with this money is there's supposed to be meaningful consultation with the community, including parents, teachers, and the whole students. So there ought to be public hearings. At the very least, there ought to be comment areas where you can put your priorities into it. But in terms of the kind of RFPs, those would come either from the state or the district when they decide what sort of services they want to offer. There's also several states who are doing grants. But a school district would apply for a grant to do summer learning or something like that. So it's my understanding it's the school districts who have control of the money and are deciding how to spend it.
Thank you so much. And then I just wanted to talk, if I could ask each one of you, Phyllis just asked very clearly what some of the next steps could be. I'm wondering if you guys would have a recommendation to our listeners today about one thing that they can do to get engaged with their schools, particularly if they're on a youth, if they work primarily in youth justice, or if you're in the schools primarily, how you can reach out to folks in the justice system so that we can begin to build this cross-sector partnership.
I'll say one thing, but I think everybody here knows more than I do on this, but I would say figure out what the school district wants and how your priorities fit into it. For instance, there's lots of school districts who are looking for students or trying to re-engage students. So if you want to make sure your students are re-engaged, you're helping the school district by saying, there are all these kids who've come out of the juvenile justice system. We haven't re-engaged them. We need to get them in. That helps the school district have more students, get more state funding. So in a way, you know what the school district's priority is, and you're putting your priorities into theirs.
Thank you, Phyllis. Janae or Rudy?
I think it's really important to reach out to educators, quite frankly. And I'm coming from an organizational, position here. I mean, we're a nonprofit, and I think that we've been reaching out to the, Principals Association, Superintendents Association, School Board Association from the beginning about best practices and the importance of these resources for schools. And over time, we've seen them shift. And quite frankly, by building those relationships, I think we, in the long term, can have much more of an impact than if we say, okay, they're the quote unquote enemy or whatever. They're the ones that are at fault. You just can't approach it that way. Ultimately, and I think you have to involve your community. We've been working very hard not only to build coalitions with those professional associations, but also with community organizations that are concerned about these issues. And we try to kind of keep them walking in step with one another on these issues. So that's what I would argue is figure out who's doing what if you're not doing it yourself. And if you are doing it, you need to be reaching out to others and bringing them, because there's a lot of people who are not working in this space that will work in this space if somebody else is leading it. And, I really encourage people to think about consensus building and coalition building.
Thank you. And Rudy?
I just love the relationship piece that I just, is it Janae, right? That Janae just mentioned. I want to make sure. That's it. I think more than anything to break down those silos and between community, that includes family, between the board, between school, between central office and school buildings, as much as possible. And Brian Stevenson talks about proximity and getting folks in proximity so we'll stop otherizing each other and begin to really collectively care about young people. I will say too, in Dane County, there's a benefit that we're still trying to capitalize on, but they actually have Madison School District teachers working as teachers within the, I'm gonna say juvenile, but we're trying to disrupt that language too and turn it to youth because of the negative connotation, and that goes to Language Matters with Maisha Wynn. But the fact that the school teachers work within these buildings, there's a link there. It's just not being capitalized as much as it could be to the benefit of young people. So I don't know how, I know it's different in different districts, but as much as possible, get them involved, because you can kind of, oftentimes it's not when the young person come in, is when they go out, and how our schools embracing them back into these environments. So staff needs to have a lot of discussion around, these are still our young folks and we embrace them. It's not our job to police them after their cases have been resolved or whatnot.
Thank you, Rudy.
I would encourage everyone to put the school to prison pipeline and harsh discipline on the agenda for this money, because it doesn't seem to be, and none of the goals that we're seeking with any of this are going to be realized if we continue to exclude kids, if we continue to spend it. It's the number is 11 million school days a year that kids, American school kids, miss because of suspensions, and hundreds of them, we don't even count them, but at least several 100,000 kids get referred to law enforcement for behaviors at school, and most of it's minor, and that's so far not being addressed with these monies, and they could be, and they should be, and they have to be. Yes, we want to, the schools have been saying, well, we need our SROs because we don't have any other way to deal with discipline problems. And when you bring up ideas like restorative justice or positive behavior and interventions and support, it takes training, it takes resources, it takes focused effort. And these monies, and they've never had it before, but they could use these monies to do those kinds of things. And so far they're not. So I hope that everyone in the around the country will start to push for those kinds of changes.
Thanks, Dick. And I go ahead, Phyllis.
I was going to add one more thing, which is when you were talking about suspensions, it sort of made me think about absences. And as you know, there were a lot of absenteeism during the pandemic, and a lot of people are rethinking how they define excused and unexcused absences in this context. That's a great opportunity to rethink how we classify absences and how we punish absences, because often truancy is sort of the first step down that road in the prison pipeline. So that's another opportunity right now as districts are rethinking their attendance definitions to get a word in about that.
That's great. And I do want to just add to that is that there are a lot of ways. This doesn't have to only happen in the courts. There's a lot of perspectives that Dick mentioned in the paper that talk about what courts have done. I think that we need to understand this as a two-way street. I know we should be encouraging our judges, our prosecutors, our heads of DJJ to also be at the table in these places. If your local detention center is its own LEA, they got money for this, from this dollars. How are they spending it? Are they spending it to get those kids reconnected back to their home schools? So this needs to be a two-way street, and really needs to be a discussion that's had both ways. In New York, I know the head of their DJJ, 5 years ago said, the juvenile justice system never says no, but we're going to start to say no. We are not the place that should serve most of the kids coming in through our front door, and you need to understand this. So that goes to a lot of what Janae was saying and Rudy was saying previously, and Phyllis. We really need to create these cross-sector partnerships with a racial equity lens in it, and to ensure that that we are finding solutions that apply to every child, regardless of their race, their gender, their identification in terms of LGBTQ youth. Children with disabilities are referred at enormous rates to our youth justice system. So any last minute comments? We're about 1 minute out. So last comments, last thoughts. Danielle, yes, there are detention centers that are classified as LEAs. I'm trying to get these last questions here. We will be following up with the PowerPoints and some other resources around how you can take action, where you can find these resources on the Department of Education website, links to our wonderful panelists and the work that they're doing in communities, so you can get in touch with them. So I just want to close with a thank you to Dick for getting us launched with a great report, and for Rudy, Phyllis, and Janae for coming today and for really giving us so much to think about. You guys are doing excellent work, and I think this was a great conversation. So thanks, everyone. We'll talk to y'all soon. Oh, bye-bye.